Welcome, everyone. We are so happy that you're here. We're going to give it just a minute to allow folks to enter into the room, and we will kick off with you shortly. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I know folks will continue to join. Again, so happy to have you here. Welcome. Thank you for joining Enterprise's webinar on the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. My name is Lindsay Knotts. I am the Assistant VP for Enterprise's Federal Policy Team. I'll be kicking off today and facilitating our conversation. Enterprise is thrilled to see this overwhelmingly bipartisan bill become law. It's the most comprehensive housing bill in the last 30 years and marks a really important moment for expanding housing affordability and preparing communities for the future. Our team has had a long track record of advocating for several of the key components, like reforming rural housing programs, reauthorizing home, advancing good land use policy, and making it easier to use rental assistance. Many of these priorities are reflected in the bill, and you'll hear about them today. We also want to take a minute to just thank our congressional partners for supporting it and being such strong champions, and really to all of you on the call today who helped shape the bill. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will be 90 minutes long. It will be recorded and we'll share the recording afterward. For our discussion today, we're going to focus on key highlights from the bill, what comes next, and some tips for where to focus. How to find more resources. There are already a lot of really great resources out there, including many from our national partners. And we'll be sure to leave some time for Q&A with our policy team. I'm sure we will not be able to get to every single question that gets asked. I'm sure there are so many great questions that folks have, but we're going to do our best. Our audience today includes partners working at the state and local level, developers, owners and operators of affordable housing, other local partners and service providers who are working to make their communities stronger, national organizations, perhaps some congressional and federal partners, and enterprise staff. Wanted to sort of give you a sense of who is probably tuned in. And again, we're just really grateful that you've joined us. Next slide, please. I am joined by several of my really amazing team members today. We have Flora Arabo, Xavier Arriaga, Emily Nosse-Leirer, and Francis Torres Gonzales. So you'll hear from each of these folks throughout the presentation, and I'm really excited for them to be able to dive in with all of you. Next slide, please. So for anyone who doesn't know Enterprise Community Partners yet, wanted to take just a minute to share who we are. We are a national nonprofit that exists to make home a good home possible for the millions of people without one. We partner with organizations at all levels, all over the country, which really informed all of the perspectives that we advocated for in the Road to Housing bill. We are really looking forward to implementing it with all of you and to building on this with future legislation and federal policy that we know we need to make our communities stronger. Next slide, please. So what's in Road? The legislation includes 47 provisions aimed at boosting housing supply and improving affordability. It has a broad array of provisions spanning new and expanded programs and incentives, changes to existing programs and policies, and other deadlines, requirements, and coordination across federal agencies. We're going to cover some of those provisions today, but certainly are not going to be able to dive into the whole bill because it's so big. We have many partners across the country who are experts on other areas of Road. We do include a list of key dates at the end of this presentation. I know that there are probably going to be a lot of questions about key dates, so want to make sure you know that that's coming and that when we share these slides, you'll have access to that. It's also important to note that this is authorizing legislation, which means that there's no federal funding tied to it. So we're going to need federal appropriations for new programs to get off the ground and to really fully realize the promise of the 21st Century Road to Housing. Next slide. You might also be wondering why this matters. From our perspective, if we keep building support for these and the other solutions that we know we need and implement them effectively, we'll expand housing affordability for families and individuals across the country at a moment when housing affordability is really one of the defining issues of our time. The legislation lets us really scale the proof points that have emerged from work in communities of all sizes, really led by probably many of you who are on the webinar today. The bill's passage is really just the beginning. The impact of it is going to depend on what happens next. It means that from this moment forward, our partnerships and collaboration are more important than ever. ROAD gives states and communities new tools to address their housing needs. And because of that, its full potential will only really be realized if states and communities take proactive steps to maximize the flexibility and changes reflected in the bill. We're also excited about ROAD 2.0 and making sure that future legislation ensures that everyone has access to the housing supply that's coming online through the many provisions reflected here. That's for another conversation, not for today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the team to walk us through some of what's actually in it and how to think about what's next. I'll pass it off to you, Xavier.
Hi, all. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Xavier Arriaga, Associate Director with Enterprise Community Partners, here to provide an overview of select new and reauthorized programs that were included in 21st Century Road, key reforms to major grant programs like the Home Investment Partnership Program, HOME for short, and Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG for short, and some select land use and zoning provisions. Before we're diving in, like Lindsay shared, I think it's important to note that 21st Century Road, and more specifically the provisions on this slide, is authorization language. This bill creates a legal framework for these programs to define how the programs work, and in some cases sets a ceiling for how much funding it may receive in the appropriations process. This is a fantastic place to be. Authorization is foundation laying, resulting from coalition building and thoughtful policy design work, and the type that is exceedingly difficult to get an appropriations bill from scratch. Now that we have the passage of 21st Century Road, we have the program names, the structure, the congressional intent, and in the case like for the Innovation Fund, a dollar ceiling amount Congress passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. So 21st Century Road provides the fantastic foundation that leads into the appropriations process in the future. With that being said, let's get talking about some of these new and reauthorized programs in the bill. Starting with the previously mentioned program, the Innovation Fund. This creates a new program within HUD to support state, local, and tribal governments that build more housing supply, providing grants for community infrastructure and housing construction. It is designed to be an incentivization program rewarding streamlining permitting, density bonuses, and zoning changes. Grants will be awarded on a competitive basis and will range from $250,000 to $10 million each. HUD is directed to establish the program within 1 year of enactment, and the program is authorized to be funded at $200 million per year for fiscal years 2027 and 2031. This makes it one of the unique programs in this bill that have a defined ceiling amount. Next, we have the Whole Homes Repair Program, a pilot program of grants and forgivable loans to help low-income homeowners and small housing providers address home repair and modification needs. These grants and forgivable loans are directed to homeowners at or below 80% of the area median income and small landlords being defined as owning less than 10 units and offering a majority of those units as affordable. Next is a price program. So this section authorizes HUD's Preservation and Reinvestment Initiative for Community Enhancement, or PRICE program, first ad hocly authorized through FY22 appropriations in subsequent fiscal years. PRICE grants can be used to construct, reconstruct, or repair manufactured housing and to improve or build facilities serving manufactured home communities in a way that protects the health and safety of residents. This bill is now reauthorized for 7 fiscal years. There's a lot of additional pilot programs, so I'll provide some quick hits here, including the Point Access Building Grant Program, which is directs HUD to establish federal guidelines on single staircase buildings, and it allows HUD to award competitive grants for pilot programs, for pilot projects testing the safety, feasibility, and effectiveness of single stair multifamily buildings, of which eligible recipients may include state and local jurisdictions, but will likely be determined by future guidance. There's also the FHA small dollar mortgage pilot. So it allows HUD to establish a pilot program to expand and access mortgages under 100,000 backed by FHA. The authority to establish this pilot expires on July 2029 and runs to 2033. There's also the temperature sensors pilot program. So it authorizes a HUD pilot program for 3 years to provide grants to public housing authorities and owners of federally assisted rental housing to install temperature sensors, encouraging compliance with temperature-related housing quality standards. HUD is directed to establish criteria, define key terms, and issue identifiable information standards by January 2027. So that is likely when we get more information on how this could be implemented. There's also the Affordable Housing Planning and Implementation Grants, which authorizes the pilot to offer competitive grants to assist planning and implementation activities associated with affordable housing for state, local, and tribal governments and regional planning agencies. These activities under this grant include updated regulatory processes, increasing capacity to conduct inspections, and coordinating housing development with transportation planning. And the last one I would touch on for new programs is the Streamlining Affordable Housing Designs pilot. So it authorizes a grant program to help communities establish pre-approved housing designs or pattern books to help streamline and expedite local construction processes and build more homes. This includes ADUs, infill developments, tri-fourplexes. 10% of the total funding reserved for 10% of funding is reserved for rural areas, and there's a 5-year window for adoption here. Now I could go on to the next slide on home reforms. So Section 501 of the 21st Century Road Housing Bill, the Home Investment Partnership and Reauthorization Reform Act, is one of the most consequential parts of the whole package, and that's perhaps a bit biased here since that is one of the main programs I work on. But it's also because home hasn't had a statutory update in decades, despite being HUD's flagship affordable housing production program and being one of the most flexible tools states and localities have to meet their affordable housing needs. So home has technically been operating with a formal authorization since the mid-1990s, and Congress had just kept funding it year to year through appropriations. This bill would authorize the home program indefinitely, giving the program more durable legal foundation and making it less of an issue in future appropriations conversations on funding unauthorized programs. This section also allows home dollars for non-entitlement areas to support infrastructure improvements directly tied to a home or LIHTC finance property. In practice, this would help smaller and rural jurisdictions where the lack of infrastructure, roads, water, or sewer has been a real barrier to building otherwise viable sites. This section also streamlines inspections and environmental reviews in a couple of ways. One, it will allow state PJs to be able to use a national physical inspection standard like NSPIRE instead of needing compliance staff training local codes across every jurisdiction of the state. Furthermore, this section provides category exemptions of home-funded activity from a full NEPA environmental review. This includes new construction on infill housing projects, acquisition of real property of affordable housing for affordable housing purposes, rehab projects, and new construction of projects of 15 units or fewer. Further on this, it would eliminate the need for duplicative environmental review for home projects that have already gone through an environmental review, and where additional federal funding is added, subbed out, or reallocated in some fashion. So as long as the project's scope, scale, or location hasn't changed, we could avoid the duplicative review in these instances, avoiding unnecessary delays and costs as home deals frequently layer multiple funding sources over time. For homeownership activities, this bill would raise the purchase price cap from 95% to 110% of the area purchase price, expanding income eligibility for home ownership to 100% AMI, and streamline the resale option so PJs could actually use it instead of defaulting to recapture, and adding protection for military members and heirs who inherit home-assisted housing. Worth noting that the rental income limits are untouched. It is still 80% AMI for other home activities. This is just providing additional flexibility for home for one of its core activities in homeownership. This also streamlines Section 3 requirements for smaller projects and PJs, with the tenant making it easier for home to be used in smaller, even rural communities. Larger PJs still will have to comply with Section 3 requirements regardless of project size. This section also streamlines CHODO requirements, qualification requirements. So currently, home grantees must set aside 15% of their funds to allocate to community housing development organizations. Previous rules made it restrictive on who can meet that definition of being a CHODO and the amount of involvement said CHODO must have across affordable housing development financed through this set aside. This bill will ease some of those requirements for nonprofit organizations to be defined as a CHODO and also make it easier for said CHODOs to partner with other organizations for projects that are financed with this set aside. Section 501 also directs HUD to study and update guidance on Build America, Buy America requirements as they apply to the home program. For folks who are not familiar with BABA, it is a federal requirement that mandates federal financial assistance to be used to purchase American manufactured materials. This puts significant tension on programs like HOME, which is already an underfunded program, but there's also additional administrative burdens, cost increases, and project delays that comes with this federal requirement. This is a very oversimplified description of BABA and its impact on home and other federal financial assistance programs. There's a lot of nuance that I'm not able to get to within my allotted time, but know that within 180 days, HUD should be providing updated guidance for BABA implementation on home. Outside of Section 501, there is Section 210, the Revitalizing Empty Structures and Desirable Environments Act, or RESIDE Act for short. This will authorize a pilot program within home to convert vacant and abandoned commercial industrial structures into attainable housing. A majority of units must serve households up to 60% AMI, and remaining units may serve households up to 120% AMI. Again, this is a pilot program that will live under the home program and will require direct appropriations for this use. And now on to CDBG reforms on the next slide. So yeah, CDBG is one of HUD's oldest and most flexible grant programs, but it's historically been more oriented towards infrastructure, public services, and rehab than actual housing production. These two provisions push CDBG more directly towards building new supply, one through a funding incentive and one through a straightforward eligibility expansion. Starting with Build Now Act, so starting in FY30, this section changes how the annual CDBG formula allocation itself works. It will tie a portion of each locality's funding directly to housing production performance. Local governments that demonstrate housing growth get a bonus on top of their standard allocation. Localities that don't show as much growth see their allocation decrease. This is a meaningfully different mechanism than most of the other bills, other provisions. Rather than just making housing activities eligible or easier, it actually provides a more carrot and stick approach to financial incentives and financially incentivizes jurisdictions to permit and build housing. So on September 9th, 2026, grantees will be receiving a notification of their housing growth improvement rate and whether they're at, above, or below the median rate. 3 fiscal years afterwards, so FY30, is when the carrot and stick approach will kick in. It's also important to know that this change does not apply to jurisdictions that they have lower than 60 percentile rents and lower than median home values. They have a higher than national rental vacancy rates. They have had a recent emergency disaster declaration in the last 3 years, or they lack the authority to allow zoning and permitting changes. So this change also does not apply to state recipients. The next CDBG reform is pretty straightforward. Section 205 will amend the CDBG program to allow CDBG funding to be used for construction of new affordable housing, capped at 20% of recipients' allocation. It is currently now an eligible use, but we will likely need to see HUD issue a notice of grantees on guidance on how to use this, hopefully in the near future. And then my last slide on land use and zoning. Go to the next one. This slide focuses on 2 provisions. First, Section 107, the Housing Supply Frameworks Act, directs HUD to publish guidelines and best practices to support the production of adequate housing to meet the needs of communities and provide housing opportunities for people at all income levels with respect to state and local zoning and land use policies. So within 2 years of enactment, HUD must publish draft guidelines and establish a consulting task force. The report itself is due within 3 years of enactment. The second is Section 104, which would require CBG grantees to maintain a publicly accessible and searchable database of undeveloped land owned by the jurisdiction. The goal is to increase transparency and awareness of publicly owned land that may represent future development opportunities. This directive will be in effect October 1st. Together, these provisions encourage local governments to evaluate zoning practices and improve information about available public land, both of which can help support housing supply and community development objectives. Thank you all so much for your time. I'll kick it off to Emily to talk about the next set of provisions in the 21st Century Road to Housing Act.
Thanks so much, Xavier. I'm Emily Nosse-Leirer. I am our Director for Rural and Native American Policy here at Enterprise. So I'll be starting off talking about rural housing. A provision that we worked very hard on in this bill was the Rural Housing Service Reform Act, which deals with USDA's housing programs for rural America. And the biggest issue here was fixing what has been a long-term problem with multifamily rental housing funded through the agency called the Section 515 program. Previously, when those mortgages were paid off, properties no longer could have any project-based rental assistance from the USDA associated with the units. And so because of that, we were on track to lose almost 400,000 affordable homes with rental assistance by 2050. So this provision allows for the creation of a standalone rental assistance program modeled on HUD's HAP contracts, and it'll allow the families who live in those units to keep paying 30% of their income towards rent, and then a rental assistance contract from the USDA will be making up the difference. Setting up this program is going to be a really significant undertaking with a large regulatory engagement necessary, and Enterprise is going to be working as hard as we can to make sure that the program is successful going forward. There also are some other important changes in this section of the bill, and I'll highlight a few here. One of them is that the USDA has a very large single-family mortgage program as well. Previously, there's been very strict prohibitions against any kind of income-producing activity in houses that are funded through that mortgage program. And now, after the passage of this Road to Housing bill, single-family borrowers are able to get some relief from that, particularly when it comes to childcare provision. So people can now provide in-home childcare businesses in those homes, or they can build and rent an ADU in their homes as well. There's also a home repair program through the USDA that has previously had a loan limit of $7,500, now has been doubled to $15,000, excuse me. That's very important because, as we all know, home repairs are unfortunately only getting more expensive over time. The bill also is going to require USDA to do a number of studies on technology needs and staffing, and we'll be advocating hard to make sure that the results of those studies are going to lead to more investments by Congress at the USDA to increase their capacity. It's always great to have data when we're going to advocate for more investment there. We have a blog on our website that dives much more deeply into this, especially the standalone rental assistance provisions. So if that's something that's of interest to you, that'll be included as a link in the follow-up slides. Next slide, please. Another area of significant interest in this bill is changes to what is considered manufactured housing. So since the 1970s, manufactured housing has been required to be built on a permanent chassis, which is what makes it at least theoretically mobile. That's where, calling it a mobile home comes from. The changes in this bill will allow manufactured housing to be built with or without a permanent chassis, and it'll continue to be possible to either put it on a permanent foundation or not put it on a permanent foundation. So this creates options for cheaper housing through removing the chassis, and also makes things like multi-story construction much more feasible. And so, we are very hopeful that this will increase the types of housing that can be produced more cheaply. Construction and efficiency standards will continue to be regulated under the HUD code here, and the bill directs HUD to establish new minimum energy efficiency standards, and it makes HUD the agency in charge of adopting other agencies' standards, such as those from the Department of Energy. So this means that manufactured housing will continue to be certified under HUD codes, not under state and local building codes, as has been the case since the establishment of this code in the 1970s. However, there's also the establishment of a definition of modular housing in this bill, and the difference between the two is quite interesting. This allows homes that are constructed in a factory and transported to the site, and are installed on a permanent foundation. It defines them as modular homes if they are subject to state and local building codes. So that's the kind of the key difference here between the manufactured and the modular definitions. There does seem to be a lot of potential overlap because of these two definitions. And so we're going to be following the regulatory process quite closely for this. And I would recommend you do the same if this is a topic that's of interest to you. It seems likely that determining what kind of home, what category a home falls under, whether it's manufactured or modular, is going to be determined both by standards set in the rulemaking and what each individual manufacturer decides that they want to be building their homes to. Next slide, please. Thank you. There are also a lot of provisions in this bill that try and reduce red tape at the federal environmental review process. So right now, there is, as you all know, probably from using federal funding, review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, can be quite a burdensome process, depending on the process. This attempts to address some of those issues. One of them includes limiting NEPA review for infill projects. So, if you have a project that has fully developed areas on all sides of it, rather than a greenfield project, some limits of the review there. It also requires joint reviews for projects that have multiple federal funding sources. So hoping to get rid of the process that sometimes we get into where there's a need to do a different study for each federal funding source. It also allows there to be more delegation of review to state, local, and tribal governments. Next slide, please. As Lindsay said at the beginning of this presentation, and Xavier also echoed, there are not very many provisions in road that are putting money out into the world to build housing immediately. So one really exciting one is the public welfare investment cap. This is, not a guarantee that more money is coming out, but it raises the amount of money that banks are potentially able to invest in public welfare investments like the low-income housing tax credit or the new markets tax credit. Currently, banks are limited in the amount of their capital and surplus that they can invest in those programs at 15%. This raises it to 20% if regulators approve. We anticipate that this will be particularly impactful for smaller regional banks who have been really approaching their 15% cap over time. The last time the PWI cap was raised, it went from 10% to 15% in 2005. And in the 20 years that followed that increase, public welfare investments went up 9 times the amount that they had been before. So while we can't yet put a dollar amount on how much money will be coming potentially to projects because of this change, we're really hopeful that there'll certainly be increased investment from our bank partners. Next slide, please. And a provision that got a lot of attention in the news this year, especially around the State of the Union, was this topic of institutional investors buying single-family homes. And so ROAD includes a provision that restricts the future purchase of those single-family homes by institutional investors, and the definition in the bill is those entities who own 350 or more single-family homes already. There are also requirements that HUD set up renter resources to support people who are renting homes owned by these kind of entities that might be having issues with their landlord. But also important to note that there are exceptions to this restriction. And so that covers a few important things like build to rent homes that are being newly built. There are also restrictions for things like home ownership programs. So, this may be a concern if you run a large home ownership program where you're buying homes and land banking, for example. And there also, we expect that under Treasury guidance, there'll be a very specific carve out for single family style low-income housing tax credit development, which we know is very common in rural and tribal areas. So there'll be guidance and resources on this topic coming over the next few years as well. And I'll be passing things to my colleague, Francis.
Thanks, Emily. And hi, everyone. I'm Francis Torres Gonzales. I'm Director for Rental Assistance Policy here at Enterprise. And I'll just be going over some of ROAD's key changes to public housing and demand-side rental assistance programs, along with reforms to HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. So these programs, and particularly the rental assistance programs, are a long-standing enterprise priority. And if implemented well, these changes will hopefully allow many more people to be served through existing rental assistance infrastructure and programs. So I'll just kick us off with a little bit of a description of Section 212 of the bill, which makes important changes to HUD's Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD. So for those of you who may not be familiar, RAD is a program that allows a select group of public housing agencies to access financing to operate and maintain public housing by converting from traditional Section 9 public housing operating subsidy to a Section 8 project-based rental assistance contract. This conversion, which I made a little visual you can refer to in the slide, but essentially this conversion opens a door to financing sources for public housing, or rather financing sources that public housing cannot otherwise use on its own, such as private debt and the low-income housing tax credit, for the purposes of rehabilitation and long-term preservation of affordable housing, while keeping the same affordability rules in place for residents. So ROAD expands the number of homes that can be converted to RAD by 100,000 units, so from 455,000 to 555,000. It also makes the program's authorization permanent, as it was previously set to expire in September of 2029. And just to emphasize this program's housing affordability mission, the expansion in ROAD establishes certain tenant protections, mandatory lease requirement, and a management plan addendum spelling out residents' rights in properties that are converted. It also requires an annual report from HUD on the outcomes for converted properties and for tenants, and it bars PHA-owned properties from being converted for purposes other than affordable housing provision. In terms of what we can expect here, HUD is expected to update the RAD program notice to implement these changes, though there's no specific statutory deadline, and there'll be more information as to what you can expect later in the presentation. Next slide. Moving on to the Moving to Work program expansion, which is also included in the bill. As many of you here are no doubt aware, the Moving to Work program, or MTW, allows a select cohort of PHAs to combine their public housing and voucher funding into a single flexible block grant, and also to get waivers from certain program rules, ultimately so they can test new and locally designed ways of running their housing programs. This is a longstanding program, but the road bill opens up a new cohort, so it adds up to 25 PHAs to the existing 100 expansion and original 39 MTW agencies. This new cohort is titled Economic Opportunity and Pathways to Independence. It is a competitive program for which PHs will have to apply, and it sets up eligibility conditions by PHA size, as shown in this graph. So up to 12 PHAs with 1,000 or fewer units, up to 8 with between 1,000 and 6,000, and up to 5 with between 6,000 and 27,000 units. And besides this size tier, it also prioritizes that HUD ensure geographic diversity in the selection of new participants in the program, as well as selecting for PHAs that serve families with children and youth aging out of foster care at a higher than average rate. And before HUD can open applications for this new cohort, it has to complete an initial report to Congress on the existing MTW cohorts, which is due 180 days after the enactment of the bill, so January 7th, 2027. Realistically, this new cohort would be set up to run well after that. Next slide. Another expansion in ROAD is this escrow expansion pilot under the Family Self-Sufficiency Program at HUD. So important distinction, this works a little bit differently from traditional FSS. This is, like FSS, it's a measure aimed at helping households in affordable housing generate savings and ultimately build greater financial stability. through quite a simple mechanism, which is illustrated here in the slide. For selected households, any increases in their rent share that result from an increase in their income will be banked in an interest-bearing escrow account rather than collected just simply as rent by the PHA or participating building. Participants would then be able to withdraw the funds from this account plus interest once they've stopped receiving welfare assistance and met one of the following conditions, so laid out in the slide. They've reached a standard window of a minimum of 5 years, a maximum of 7 years in the pilot. They've exited HUD rental assistance altogether before a 5-year mark, or they're using the funds to advance approved self-sufficiency goal, or they qualify for a HUD-determined hardship exemption. There's some specifics here that are going to be worked out in the implementation and guidance HUD will provide. But we can also add that it's already in the bill statutorily, the family income for participating households cannot exceed 80% AMI at time of enrollment to be eligible. And HUD may select up to 25 participating agencies or project-based rental assistance programs to run this pilot, serving a combined total of up to 5,000 families nationwide. And unlike a traditional FSS program, in this pilot, participants would not have to sign a contract of participation or complete individual training, which would make it easier for PHAs to enroll and retain families. Enrollment is also automatic, kind of to pursue that purpose of ease of enrollment. An implementation note here is HUD has up to a year after standing up the pilot to select the entities that will administer it. And those entities have another 6 months to open the accounts. So again, we are seeing a long timeline for implementation of this. Next slide. Okay, so this one's quite a big change to household support programs, and one that enterprise and many partner organizations have been advocating for several years. Section 405 of ROAD, the titled Choice and Affordable Housing Act. It's aimed at reducing inspection-driven delays in the lease-up for participants of the Housing Choice Voucher program, including tenant and project-based vouchers. When implemented, this will allow homes that have already been inspected to comply with a few other federal programs, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the Home Program, USDA Rural Housing Service, within the past year to automatically meet the inspection requirement for the HCV program. It also allows landlords entering the voucher program to request for their units to be pre-inspected before a PHA matches a voucher holder to the home, rather than waiting until after a match is made. And it builds on a few lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic by allowing HUD to permit remote, so virtual inspections in some specific cases. And we can get into that later on in the questions. But ultimately, this is a measure that is meant to lower the time and process costs that HCV landlords experience and incentivize more landlords to participate in the program and open up more housing options for voucher holders. Currently, less than 60% of households that receive a voucher are able to secure housing before it expires. And that's the population of people that are lucky enough to get a voucher in the first place. So really, this is tackling a significant structural problem with the program to open up more housing options to families and households with vouchers. And again, just in terms of implementation, both for this program as well as for every other program I've discussed, and as my colleagues have said, passing ROAD is really just the first step in achieving these policy changes. This is going to kick us off in a complex and quite lengthy regulatory process before any of these programs or the new rules start influencing real world conditions. And just to give folks a little bit of background, in the past, HUD has taken years to complete rulemaking and guidance processes in similar programs. You know, each program varies, so I don't want to extrapolate too much from this, but just by way of an example, when Congress authorized the expansion for moving to work in 2016, 2015, HUD's final notice for implementation, which happened after 2 rounds of draft guidance, wasn't published until 2020. So you see there's a big delta between, legislative action and then things actually ultimately playing out in the ground. So considering just the pace of of implementation in past programs, as well as the staff reductions in the agency in recent years, it stands to reason that guidance for a lot of these new programs will take a significant amount of time to get out the door. And next slide. And then just to culminate my section, I want to talk about one of the under-discussed changes in the bill, but one that is near and dear to partners and communities that have dealt with major disaster recoveries in recent years. This is the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, part of ROAD that authorizes important changes to HUD's CDBGDR program. So it's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, quite a mouthful. But it is one of the most important federal programs for disaster recovery. CDBG fills the recovery gap for low and moderate income disaster survivors after initial FEMA and SBA assistance is exhausted, funding things like home rebuilding, buyouts of damaged properties, and infrastructure repair. But it has quite often lagged behind the need in disaster and in places impacted by disasters. On average, it takes about 20 months from disaster to that first CDBGDR dollar getting dispersed, and it can take far longer. For example, in 2019, after major earthquakes in Puerto Rico, it took HUD upwards of 650 days just to make the funding allocation. So this is largely due to the program's ad hoc nature. It's not permanently authorized, and its rules, procedures have to be set through separate one-off disaster recovery bills passed by Congress after every disaster. And so ROAD authorizes CDBGDR for 3 years and creates a new HUD Office of Disaster Management and Resiliency to coordinate response with the other agencies involved, so FEMA, Small Business Administration. It also establishes a standing structure to staff the program and publish a standardized methodology and rules. So again, rather than starting from scratch after each disaster. It establishes as well a long-term disaster recovery fund, which will pool CDBGDR appropriations into one standing account that stays available until spent, which ultimately just gives HUD a more reliable account to draw from. And these changes, again, like I said at the top, are meant to streamline the deployment of federal disaster assistance and give disaster impacted communities greater transparency and predictability around the assistance they can expect to receive. And then in closing, this and every other change I've mentioned, it either is expanding or creating a tool to give public housing authorities, residents of affordable housing, landlords interested in the HCB program, and disaster impacted communities greater flexibility and predictability. But there's a long way to go. And as my colleagues have mentioned, Enterprise will keep tracking these provisions as HUD and other agencies stand up rules and guidance, and we'll work with our partners and fellow advocates to ensure the full promise of these programs is realized. And now I'll pass it on to Flora Arabo, Assistant Vice President of State and Local Policy, to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Francis. Hi, everyone. I'm Flora Arabo. I lead our work on state and local policy. And today I'm going to talk about what comes next and what you can do. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what state and local governments in particular can do. And the reason for that is because the majority of what was discussed today will be implemented by or through state and local governments. I'll also be talking about what all of our stakeholders and partners can be doing, because community-based organizations, public housing authorities, developers, owners, and other constituents will all be impacted by the changes in this bill. So although implementation is a long-term game, I do think that there are specific steps that states can take right now. These are really like my top 3 things that I would urge states to do. The first is to work with your housing finance agencies to assess all the federal funding streams that your state uses to finance multifamily housing, and think through how changes to programs like USDA 515, 521, HOME, CDBG, RAD, and others may impact the way that you finance affordable housing in the future. The second thing is around manufactured housing and preparing to conform to the new HUD code. So the new law requires that states within 1 year of enactment certify to HUD that they have conformed to the new HUD code on manufactured housing, or in 2 years for legislatures that only meet biennially. We are expecting to see guidance from HUD on what the new HUD code is, but the legislation does not specify when HUD has to release that information. So we're all going to have to be watching out for that together and prepared to move when that information is released. Finally, there is a lot that states can do to inventory state laws and determine where those laws may be inhibiting local governments from increasing housing production. A lot of times states preempt local governments, and it's going to really matter moving forward. As has been mentioned, there are some provisions in the bill, in particular the Build Now Act, which changes the formula to CDBG, and the Innovation Fund, if it is funded and when it is funded, that will incentivize and reward production. Next slide, please. There is definitely a lot in here for local governments to digest. The first and probably most important right now is the Build Now Act and the way it changes the CDBG allocation formula. So without going into too much detail, what I will say is that while the changes to the formula do not go into effect for 3 fiscal years, so there will be no change to the formula before federal fiscal year 2030. Within 60 days of enactment, which is actually 30 days from today, jurisdictions will receive from HUD their annual housing production growth rate. And what that is a 5-year look back period to determine each jurisdiction's housing supply growth. That would allow jurisdictions to see where they are in relation to all other CDBG entitlement areas. And that will matter because it will give local governments 3 years to increase their housing production to hopefully be one of the jurisdictions that receives a bonus under the new formula and not a penalty. The second thing is that local governments can also be doing an inventory, much like I suggested that states do, to determine where they can remove barriers to production and preservation and increase supply in preparation for that Build Now provision, but also in preparation should the Innovation Fund be funded by Congress in future years. And then finally, local governments should be on the lookout for when these new programs are funded. If they're funded, many of them will require a competitive application, such as the regional planning grants and single staircase pilot. And so local governments are going to need to be prepared to submit really strong applications. Next slide, please. And then, of course, a lot of things that all of our stakeholders can be doing today. With some of the things that I've mentioned, the people on this call today will be absolutely critical in partnering with and helping inform and support state and local governments as they explore and implement all of these changes. For example, I might recommend that states convene all of their stakeholders on manufactured housing. So, for example, owners of resident-owned manufactured housing communities, manufacturers of modular housing, other experts in off-site construction to come together and understand what these changes mean and be prepared to work with the federal government to implement those changes. Some other specific actions I do want to point out that the legislation allows HUD to prioritize opportunity zones in its funding award decisions. Should HUD decide to do that, it will be really important for states to think now about how they want to designate their opportunity zones. So as a quick refresher, last summer, the tax reconciliation package extended the opportunity zone tax incentive and allowed governors to redesignate their opportunity zones. Those designations are due at the end of September, so just under 2 months. States can request a 30-day extension to that deadline, but once those opportunity zones are selected, they will remain in place for the next 10 years. So now is the time to be thinking through where folks want to be sure that HUD is concentrating its funds over the next 10 years and other investments. Everyone should be assessing their federal funding streams. It's really important that any stakeholder knows exactly what federal funds you utilize or rely on and whether or not those programs are impacted by this legislation. Although this is really specific, I also feel very strongly that there are a lot of people here on today's call that are well positioned to comment on the CDBG DR draft regulations. This legislation actually moves pretty quickly with regard to changes to CDBG DR. In fact, the first deadline for HUD to release the first deadline in the bill is this week. Just yesterday was the deadline for HUD to publish the latest formula allocation methodology for CDBG DR. I'm not aware that they've actually done that, but if folks are, feel free to let us know. The frontline responders who we work with are best positioned to help inform HUD on this program. We should see draft regulations in 6 months and final regulations in a year. So relative to other provisions, this one moves pretty quickly. And then, of course, last thing I'll say is that developers and owners are really uniquely positioned to help local governments as they're thinking through things like single staircase buildings and pattern books and other newly authorized programs should they be funded by Congress. Next slide, please. Okay, so just real quickly, let's talk about key deadlines and dates. I am not going to read this slide. As we mentioned, these slides will be available to you to read later. What I really want to impress upon you is the scale and scope of work that HUD has before it right now. This slide just shows you some of the deadlines for the first 6 months post enactment, and really just those specific to the provisions that we've highlighted today. So as you can see, HUD has a lot it needs to be doing over the next 6 months. And what I would emphasize is that HUD is very short-staffed at the moment. It calls into question whether or not the agency has the capacity to meet all of these deadlines. Of course, other agencies also have a lot of work to do, USDA, Treasury, OCC, and others. Next slide, please. These are just some of the deadlines for the remainder of the first year. Again, I am not going to read through these, but you can really see all of the demands that are going to be on HUD between now and next summer. But I also think that it demonstrates an opportunity for everybody who's on this call to engage HUD on rulemaking guidance and anything else. HUD is going to need our support as well in creating programs that are really effective and achieve Congress's intent in creating all of these changes and programs. So be on the lookout for all of these things. Next slide, please. And just again, this is a really long-term game. Implementation will continue well into years 2 through 5. It's going to require a lot of time and patience as the federal agencies issue clarification, guidance, reports, regulations, and more. And so I think we all are really excited and look forward to seeing what comes next and working with you. But I will stop there and turn it over to Lindsay so we can do some Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Flora. And thanks to all of our presenters for walking us through so much good information. Next slide, please. So we are going to dedicate some time to Q&A. We have many questions coming in the chat. Some of those questions are being answered live in writing. I will voice over some of those responses too, just so that we can all sort of hear that together. We also got some questions before the webinar that folks actually submitted. And so we're going to start with a couple of those and then start working through lots of great discussion here. So the first question, when will there be more money? And if yes, when? So as has been shared here, we're just going to start with this one because it's really important and I think it begs us repeating. Only a few of these provisions in the law actually authorize any new funding, and none of the provisions actually provide the funding. Really, Road just greenlights Congress to provide money for these programs. It doesn't actually cut the check. So this means that advocates across the country, many of you, right, are going to have to continue your efforts to encourage congressional partners to appropriate money for these programs starting now. For those of you who are working on the ground, would just encourage you, I think Flora just mentioned this as well, to figure out where you want to see new money appropriated and make that known to your congressional partners, but also to the many advocates who are working on this stuff across the country. Another question, will there be support among grassroots community groups for implementation? I really love this question. I think it's sort of at the heart of the matter. From our perspective, the opportunity in front of us is to really engage with all kinds of stakeholders in our communities to understand what matters most to them right now, what matters most to you right now, where there are opportunities to make the biggest changes and to get the affordable housing wins that you all need on the ground. And how do we build support with local and state partners around that work? Then, as Flora just mapped out, figure out what your levers are. Is it weighing in through open comment periods, engaging with your state and local officials, or advocating for more appropriations and funding? For so much of this bill, the work is really ahead of us to implement it. And so that's actually the stuff that matters most. All right, how will Enterprise be trying to shape the rulemaking? The team pictured here and several other colleagues on the federal policy team and really at the state and local level too are going to be independently and together with our partners continuing to engage around regulations and with agency staff as rules are crafted and regulations and other guidance is being developed. We are also going to make ourselves available as a resource to federal agencies as they compile reports and studies required by this law. We really want to be engaged in this and intend to be deeply engaged in it moving forward. We know that there are a lot of questions about the rulemaking timeline, which Flora just mapped out some of that. And again, that will be shared when we share the recording of the webinar. So much of it is still TBD. Flora, a question for you here. What can we say to our lawmakers to help push for affordable, quality, subsidized housing?
That is a great question. I'm going to assume that the the person who submitted the question means, what can we be saying to state and local lawmakers about affordable, continuing to push for affordable housing? If it were me, the message that I would want to convey to lawmakers at the state and local level is that this legislation, while important, while monumental, is a start, and it's a great start. As it stands, it will certainly create progress. It will move the needle on housing supply. But on its own, I don't think that this bill will close the gap in most of our communities. And in fact, for many of us, the greatest need in our communities is at the most deeply subsidized, below 30% AMI level, which is an area that the market often won't build to without deep subsidies from all levels of government. So I guess what I'm saying is I would frame the 21st century road to housing legislation as the beginning of our work, not the end. It will require federal, state, and local governments to work together with philanthropy and the private sector to really solve the housing crisis. So this is not a time to relent or to back down on any of our commitments, but to really go all in and augment this opportunity that has been provided through this legislation.
Great. Thanks so much, Flora. One of the questions that we got early in the webinar, which is such a great question, is how are we translating the Road to Housing Act and these new programs into information that local communities and housing partners can easily understand and act on? I think it dovetails really nicely with the response that Flora just shared. And are there plans for tools, guidance, and technical assistance to help communities identify which opportunities apply to them and prepare to access that funding? Being able to translate this for communities and partners is really the name of the game. The short answer to this is yes. Exactly what that looks like is still a work in progress, but you should definitely expect this to happen across a number of national organizations, including Enterprise, as we work to make sure that this information is really actionable. And certainly from a TA perspective, we could expect to see a lot of really great TA opportunities emerging as folks really seek to put this into practice at the local level. And so, again, the answer is yes. Exactly what that looks like is stuff that is still a work in progress and to be determined. So our next question, and I think this is a question for you, Xavier. The Innovation Fund has no money yet, correct? If not, how soon would an appropriation for the program happen? I'm guessing not before FY28 or 29, perhaps. Can you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one that's a little multifaceted here. At this juncture, yes, the THUD bill that could come out of FY27 could theoretically include up to $200 million for the Innovation Fund as part of the final enacted bill. We are at the stage where the House legislation has already been moved through that chamber. We are still waiting to see the Senate THUD proposal, and we are currently entertaining 2 separate continuing resolutions to mid-December. All that to say is that, yes, there is a possibility in which the Innovation Fund and many of these other pilot programs could get funded in FY27, but I think there is a lot of consideration as we are already so far along into the FY27 appropriations process that will cause a lot of complication for that. It's not impossible, though.
Great, thanks, Xavier. Another question that's probably for you, maybe some of our other colleagues can jump into, when will individual PJs implement some of the home changes that do not require HUD to change any rules or create a new program? And is there any way to make these changes happen quicker as program participants?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of these changes are actually written directly into the home statute. So many of the environmental changes that are home specific in Section 501 are technically ready to go immediately. We will likely have to see HUD issuing implementing guidance to all the participating jurisdictions, which we are hoping to see soon. And some of that could be issued, like, working with the administration, encouraging the administration to release that guidance a little sooner than later. And a technical stance that language is ready to go immediately, aside from things like the BABA study.
Great. Flora, can you talk a little bit more about the Build Now program?
Sure. I did see a lot of questions about that. So the Build Now program, this is Section 213 of the legislation, changes the formula allocation for the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG. A lot of people are kind of calling this the stick/carrot approach because it will create a bonus or a penalty for entitlement areas, depending on their housing production growth rate. So as I mentioned earlier, 60 days after enactment, HUD is required to notice CDBG recipients of their, quote, annual housing growth rate. What that is HUD will select a data source. So we don't know what data source they'll select. They'll look back 5 years, they'll calculate your housing growth rate, and they'll send you a notice. And that is the first piece of information you would get from HUD on whether or not you would potentially receive a bonus or a penalty if the program were to be enacted today. The program will not be enacted until federal fiscal year 2030. So there is time for jurisdictions to improve their housing growth rates if they are, look like they could be subject to a penalty. I do want to point out that there are a lot of exemptions to this formula change. As somebody asked in the chat, are states exempt? The answer is yes. Any entity that cannot enact local zoning changes, which are states, are exempt from this. So state recipients will not be impacted by this. The other two is anyone who has a higher than national vacancy rate on rental units. The third one would be jurisdictions that have lower than 60th percentile rents and lower than median home values. And then the really big exemption are those jurisdictions that have had an emergency disaster declaration in the last 3 years. So when we looked at this internally, folks on our research team found that of the roughly 1,200 CDBG recipients in the country, about 880 of them would be exempt from this provision just based on the emergency declaration alone, because so many jurisdictions have had declarations in the last 3 years. Now, we made some assumptions about what those provisions mean. We don't know what data source HUD is going to use. And so that's really just an estimate, but also just to demonstrate, I think, how complex this provision is.
Great, thank you, Flora. All right, next question. What's the latest on the Choice Neighborhood Grant Program?
I could take a stab there. So, Choice Neighborhoods Grant Program is one of those programs that are currently being funded at an ad hoc basis or authorization and appropriations. One that has been recently targeted for a significant amount of cuts. The latest Senate CR includes a temporary extension of the Choice the neighborhoods program. So that's still subject to be enacted. It passed favorably in the Senate on an overwhelming bipartisan basis, but we will still have to see if that actually makes it to the finish line in the future.
Thanks, Xavier. Laura, I think this is another question for you. It's an interesting question. It says, I live in California. Much of what was presented appears to be in action to a degree here. In action to a degree here. Are there ways that California can step up to offer greater support?
Yeah, I think there are ways that a lot of states, especially depending on where they are, can step up to offer more support. When I think of California, the first thing that comes to mind for me is CDBG DR. There's a lot at stake for communities like Altadena, not just across California, but Colorado, Louisiana, Florida, other places that rely on the CDBG DR program are really well positioned to comment on those regs when they come out. I also think that some places, thinking about my hometown, Detroit, I think they have a lot at stake in the whole home repair program and the Reside Act. And if those programs are funded and if HUD establishes regulations or guidance for how those programs are going to operate, they should absolutely be prepared because I think that those programs are exciting and could be really transformative for communities that have a lot of vacant structures and in need of a lot of home repairs.
Yeah, so much interesting opportunity there for sure. Emily, there is a question in the chat that you responded to, but I think it would be helpful to have a little bit more conversation about it. Because I imagine that it's a question that others have as well. So can manufactured homes under this definition be installed on a permanent foundation? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for asking this question. So the answer is yes, they can be, but they also cannot be. And so that is, I think, kind of indicative of the very interesting landscape that we're going to be facing with these programs going forward. Manufactured homes previously have been able to be both on permanent foundations or not on permanent foundations. That generally the choice there is depending on the underlying land ownership. So, frequently if it's some, land that you own, then you're able to put it on a permanent foundation. There also are requirements related to states regarding safety as well. And so the answer is both yes and no.
Thanks, Emily. Francis, a question for you. Again, one that you did respond to in the chat, but this is a question I've heard in one form or another a couple of times now regarding HCV inspections. Does it work in reverse with home inspections? Meaning that if a unit is inspected for housing choice vouchers, does it have to be inspected for home too?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to expand a little bit on what I added in the chat. So Section 405 of the bill basically amends the specifics of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So there is now language that's changing or creating exemptions for or new ways of meeting the inspection requirements specifically to that program. So it's not really changing like the parallel authorizing language for other programs in the same way. And so essentially all this to say it is unidirectional, is about just facilitating HCV inspections by avoiding duplicative ones from other programs, but it's not creating a network of, where each program meets every other program's inspection requirement.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
All right, I think this is a question for you, Xavier. With the exception of the Build America, Buy America requirements, are all of the reform provision to home enacted immediately? Or do all home provisions require additional rulemaking?
So it's a bit of a mix. I think overall, I think even with the program or the sections or provisions that are written in statute or able to be like ready immediately, it will still require or likely require HUD to provide implementing guidance to all the grantees before going full steam ahead with some of those things. There's some aspects of the rulemaking for the categorical exemptions that should be expecting within the year or two.
Great, thank you. With the environmental review changes, I'm assuming HUD needs to make these policy changes prior to implementation. Anybody want to jump in there? I'll read it again. With the environmental review changes, the person who asked the question is saying they're assuming HUD needs to make these policy changes prior to implementation.
I will try to take a stab at it, Flora. Maybe I'll take a stab at it first. I think some of, if we're referring to the unlocking provisions and some of the categorical exemption provisions through home, we are expecting to see rulemaking a year after enactment for those provisions. And even in between, we should be expecting implementing guidance from HUD be submitted or be sent to grantees.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are actually a lot of provisions in the bill with regard to environmental reviews and NEPA. There are actually 5 sections that touch on this, so I'm going to list them off real quick so that folks can have them if you want them. Section 103, which is for rural housing service projects. Section 205 in the Build Housing Act. Section 206. Section 501, that's the one that streamlines through the home program, and then Section 802. Those 5 provisions all address environmental review in some way. So unfortunately, it depends on which provision you're asking about.
Great, thank you, Xavier and Flora. I'm going to read a couple of the questions and responses from the chat because there are so many really good questions that are in here. When will whole home repairs be available for nonprofits to access? So this new program would not be available until and unless Congress provides an appropriation for the program. Is there a link to this temperature sensor program? There is not yet. The program is authorized by this legislation, but HUD would need to establish rules for the program, and Congress would need to provide an appropriation to provide the grants authorized under the provision. And then we have a question in here about large institutional investors, of course, a really important topic. I don't know, Andrew, if you're available to come off mute and answer it. The question is regarding the limits on large institutional investors owning homes. Are there any mechanisms to ensure that investors don't just form separate LLCs or other entities that mask ownership? Are you in a position to answer verbally? All right. I'm going to share what has been, what we're sort of tracking here, which is that the specifics of enforcement aren't fully clear yet, but large institutional investors have annual reporting requirements to HUD, and potential violations of law by large institutional investors are subject to fines for $1 million or 3 times the purchase price of a home, whichever is greater, to be enforced by Treasury or the Department of Justice. So HUD also has to establish a toll-free number and website to report renter disputes. But the bill also requires the HUD secretary to promptly investigate any disputes related to the violation of the law that comes through one of those channels, as well as shared potential violations of state law with the relevant state. So again, really important question, and thank you for putting it into the chat. All right, let's see. Any insights into if the HUD map guide will be updated to reflect the environmental review changes? Anybody want to jump in there? We don't know.
Yeah, I think this probably is something where we're going to be have to follow the regulations really closely.
Yeah.
One of just many instances.
Yep. Great. All right. Do the provisions that tie allocations to housing growth rates take into account situations where large numbers of units have been entitled by the jurisdiction, but where market conditions still don't have new construction feasible? And I think you touched on this earlier, Flora.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I can address a couple of questions at once, because there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that we just don't have the answers to until we see guidance from HUD. There's another question on the same provision on whether or not jurisdictions can get the bonus if they also meet one of the exemptions. And the answer to both questions and really all of these is that we don't know. There's not the legislation in many sections leaves us wanting a lot more because there just isn't sufficient detail. We could make assumptions about that. I could, make an assumption. My assumption would be that you would qualify. If I were HUD, I'd say, sure, you still qualify for the bonus, unless you raise your hand and say, no, please exempt me. But HUD may have a different interpretation. And so there's just no way to know right now.
Great. Thanks, Flora. All right. I have a question for you, Emily. Road has many pilot programs that will require a lot of work to implement. Is there a danger that our efforts at advocacy going forward will fracture our advocacy efforts?
That's such a good question.
And how will we focus?
Yes, that's such a good question. I would say that I think there are a lot of provisions in road, but I also think that there are, there were almost 1,000 people signed up for this webinar, and I think every single one of you is specialized in a specific area. I would focus on the programs that just have the most potential impact on the people that you're serving and the jurisdictions that you're in. I think there are more than enough of us to go around on implementing these programs. So would encourage people to stay optimistic and not get discouraged on it. And if anyone else on the team has another answer, please go.
No, I think that's fantastic. Thanks, Emily. And thank you for the question. It's such a good one. All right, this question is for maybe Xavier or Flora. What happens to the newly authorized programs if Congress does not appropriate funding to them? Does the act allow them to hang around indefinitely, or will they disappear softly into the night? Good question.
I could start off. So many of the pilot programs have a set date in which they are to sunset. I think most of them are around 2031, but we have some things going all the way to 2033. As far as it going quietly into the night, we're hoping that with the amount of folks who are on this call and amount of advocates who are work so strongly to get these bills in, that we will at least raise to Congress how important these are and get some funding dedicated to these pilots. Kick it over to Flora.
Yeah, actually, Xavier, before you mute yourself, I was going to say, in addition to sunsets that come in, 3, 4, 5 years in many cases, because I think off the top of my head, all of the newly authorized programs that I can think of that we've covered today do have a sunset. The pilots do. I think it's worth noting that we are already approaching FY27. Xavier, do you want to talk a little bit? Because people want to know how early we could get funding. Could we get funding in FY27? Do you want to just talk about how we're like in a most likely in a CR situation right now and what that means for approps?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to dive into a little bit right now. Mentioned earlier that we are currently very deep into the FY27 appropriations process, where the House has fundamentally moved a decent majority of their 12 appropriations bills through the process. We have seen the THUD bill go through subcommittee and full committee level in the House. We are still waiting to see the proposed Senate THUD legislation, but from all reports that we're hearing, that bill has been at least decently baked in prior to the enactment of the 21st Century Road to Housing, which puts a lot of pressure into the conferencing part or the negotiation part for end of year spending bills. We are already having continuing resolutions in the House and Senate being considered into mid-December. Congress is very distracted, reasonably so, with midterm elections, and to the likelihood of a lot of these provisions getting some funding in a conferencing level it's very difficult at that stage. It's not impossible, especially since we got a significant bipartisan success with this bill. But with how far along we are with FY27, it is going to be very complicated to get funding for these pieces of legislation. But it sets up a very strong advocacy battle for FY28 for sure.
All right, great. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Thank you all for such great questions that you've put into the chat. Just a reminder to continue putting questions in the chat instead of raising your hand. That'll help us make sure we can track all of it. Just a quick follow-up question for you, Xavier, and then I have one for you, Francis, that's next. Is the pilot funding predetermined, or can Congress appoint whatever they want, or some hybrid of this?
Yeah, it's so other than for the Innovation Fund, which has a predetermined cap of up to $200 million a year. I think that's how the language should be treated, is that appropriators could fund up to $200 million. Realistically, appropriators could also use their flexibility to go higher, lower, somewhere in between. $0 is also an option there for these pilot programs. Other programs that have a determined ceiling, that is up to the discretion of appropriations as well.
Great. Thanks, Xavier. All right, Francis, for smaller or emerging nonprofit affordable housing developers that do not yet have a large development portfolio, which road to housing provisions or implementation opportunities should we be watching most closely over the next 12 to 18 months? And where could organizations like ours realistically enter the process? It's such a great question.
That's a great question. And I mean, there's a longer version of the answer than I think I can give here, but just a few things I would know. Some of my colleagues have mentioned the home reforms in the bill, CHDO. That's probably the biggest bang for your buck in terms of small developers. From my section, I would just note that the escrow expansion pilot opportunity is also an opportunity for project-based rental assistance owners, and so there's definitely something there in that section worth reviewing, and to an important extent as well, an opportunity to work on or collaborate on new RAD deals as they emerge, given the changes to RAD in this bill. So those are just three points I would direct your attention to.
Great. All right. With that, we're going to wrap up our Q&A. John, if you could put the slide on the screen with the resources. We want to just make sure that folks see, we've linked to several resources here: bill text, the summary of the section breakdown, Enterprise's landing page on Road that's going to continue to evolve as we develop more resources, and then a whole bunch of really great resources from our partners that are really worth diving into. And again, you'll have access to this when we send the recording, and would encourage you to dive in more deeply if you have other questions, but also just keep looking back at Enterprise's website, but also the website of a lot of our other partners as we continue to roll out more information as we get deeper into the bill. And with that, I want to thank everyone for spending the last hour and a half with us. This has been a really rich conversation. I hope that it's been helpful, and I want to thank all of the presenters, my team at Enterprise, for sharing your expertise and time. And we're just really grateful to be in it with you. And cheers to lots of really good implementing ahead. So thanks.